packet pushers.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. We're coming up on the end of the year, and we've got an all-news episode for you. So Drew and I are here, and lots of juicy stuff this week, this month. I mean, we kind of do roundups now about monthly, I guess.
Yeah, lots of tasty things to dive into. So let's get right into it. First, I found a story about an insurance provider called Crum and Forrester have announced a new insurance policy for Chief Information Security Officers, or CISOs. This is designed to shield CISOs from personal liability. I twigged to this one just because I'm sort of really interested in cyber insurance and how it works. On the notion, I think corporations, a lot of them already cover like C-level executives like CEOs and CFOs in their personal liability shields. And this is now bringing CISOs into the mix. I guess depending on the corporate structure, CISOs might not be covered on sort of a blanket C-level policy if your company already has one. So this one would include coverage for legal defense costs, including civil and criminal proceedings. Also includes coverage for issues related to SEC disclosure rules. And JJ, you and I just recorded an episode with a CISO about what the CISO role is like. And one of the things he said was, yes, if there is a significant security breach, you can expect it to be on the hook for that. So if I was a CISO, I would want this personal insurance, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you brought up a great point that in most organizations, at least, the CISO is not big C or little c. We joke about that a lot. It doesn't matter. The CISO is typically not in the corporate organizational structure from a legal responsibility standpoint, which means they don't have the same expectations, but also they don't have the same liability coverage that layer of other C-level executives have.
Yeah.
It is different, but the crappy kind of flip side of that coin is, you as a CISO can be held personally liable for the behavior of what happens in your organization within the security program. So, you have all of the risk, but you don't have the authority and the protection that your peers have.
Right. Yeah. So I guess this insurance company identified a gap in the market, and I wouldn't be surprised if it gets filled.
Yeah, I'm interested to see that. And I think maybe, Drew, probably at some point in the next few months, we'll circle back around to something along those lines, because we've had a lot of professional protection and insurance and coverage. I mean, I know as an independent contractor now, I have layers of stuff required by different clients for different reasons. But even just like serving on boards, the board of a company, but also board of like a nonprofit organization. And we have D&O, director and officer insurance for that. And there's also, PDL, which is like personal director liability insurance that people can get. So it's great to see that this is getting extended and that CISOs can take advantage of that.
And just a teaser, if you haven't heard it already, I recorded an episode on cyber insurance. I talked with a policyholder about, how they incorporate cyber insurance into sort of their risk management and what the insurer wants to look for in terms of controls and such. It's a really interesting episode. So that's already published. You can go check that out. We'll have a link in the show notes. But we'll move on. The FBI and CISA released a joint statement on November 13th saying Chinese attackers had compromised multiple telecommunications companies in the U.S. and stolen customer call records data, eavesdropped on private communications among, quote, a limited number of individuals who are primarily involved in government or political activity, end quote, and also copied information related to U.S. law enforcement requests. This got the attention of the U.S. Senate and others because it's bad.
It is bad. Now, we are recording this at the very end of November. It's the 26th. So this statement that you referenced there was from, a couple weeks ago, 10, 13 days ago. And this continues just escalating. So this is kind of the gift that keeps on giving, because like the public, as we were told, thought that Chinese actors had come in and had what I would call kind of metadata. Like they could see call history logs or certain types of metadata, but not actual communications. What we have since learned is they did have access to unencrypted communication, which could be phone calls and standard text messages, anything not protected by, an upper layer level of crypto, like a messaging app. Mm-hmm. And certainly anything between, like, let's say, an Android and an Apple device, if you're not using an app, those text messages are going to be sent in clear text. So it was, okay, they actually got access to the actual call content itself,
right,
and the audio. And then it was, okay, they didn't just hit, I don't even remember the order we had now, but it was, AT&T, Verizon, and then T-Mobile came into the swing. So you're talking about all of the major telecom providers here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very troubling. We leave sort of communication security essentially up to individuals by downloading like a Signal or a WhatsApp. I wonder if this will change going forward, particularly for government employees and folks in sensitive industries.
Yeah, it's a weird, twisty thing. I'm not a telecom specialist, so I'm going to make some kind of generic comments here of my understanding from talking to those people. Whether we're talking about, cellular, or really more importantly, all of the stuff behind cellular, because we talk about all of the cool like 5G technology and security and IMSIs and this and that. But once the data hits, the world is wireless, but the back end of the world is not wireless. Like
There's still a backbone.
there's still cables. So that part of the infrastructure, talking to people, and maybe we'll grab one on the show in a few weeks, but the people that do work deeply in that space and understand, the protocols and what happens between the handoffs between those networks I would best describe it as super janky and not secure, and using protocols that are decades old, like most of our telecom infrastructure. So I'm not shocked by this. I think this has been something that's been in the back of many people's minds, in the front of some people's minds for years.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. And you dropped in a related story saying that the U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is directing employees to reduce their use of mobile phones for work in light of these breaches, and saying they should get on platforms like Teams or Cisco WebEx or anything that's using encryption to do their work communication.
Yeah, I mean, they did say that. However, I would put the little asterisk that that's almost comedic on the heels of one of the European delegates who dialed into a WebEx or a Teams meeting or Zoom or something, and they were on the phone and those communications were not secured, because you can dial into these calls from your phone. So, it depends on how you're securing the platform, and it depends on how you're accessing the platforms.
Yes.
But when you have a phone number and people can dial in by the phone, we saw that just earlier this year where, I think during the Russia-Ukraine conflict, some delegates from other countries were targeted in that manner. And Russia was able to learn of some of the responses that these other allied countries were going to have.
Right. There's always a hole somewhere.
Yeah, I know. It feels like it's beyond an uphill battle sometimes. It's just, I almost want to give up occasionally. But don't give up, people. Don't give up. Fight the good fight. The last thing I want to say about that story is, despite China's vehement
denials,
statements that they are not doing anything wrong, right? They're just completely denying all of the allegations and going, oh no, we care about cybersecurity and we would never do such a thing. Obviously, they've been caught red-handed multiple times in places, and they do think that this is part of the bigger picture of, China positioning themselves in advance of conflicts such as with Taiwan.
Sure. Yep, makes sense.
Actually, one of the other links we'll drop in the show notes talks about, I think it's a CISO article. I'll find it if it's not already in here. We'll drop it in the show notes, but they're talking about that they've found persistence in Chinese assets within things like HVAC controls in server rooms, as an example. So you can kind of extrapolate what might happen there.
Right. Yes. So links in the show notes if you want to read up on that. JJ, you found a story about Russian spies finding a way to jump Wi-Fi networks.
Yeah, this one came across a few days ago. And of course, anything related to Wi-Fi security, I love. This one was particularly interesting. And actually, the details of this were just released, but it happened a couple of years ago. And this company called Velocity, I think they're in the Maryland, D.C. area, but don't quote me on that part. They had a customer whose environment they were managing, monitoring for security. And ultimately what they found is that one of the Russian groups had entered into an organization's network. I believe the first one they got into through, it was either RDP or it was SSL VPN. And follow along here because there's 3 different companies.
Okay.
So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3.
Yep.
The company number 3 was the target.
Okay.
They got into company 1. They were able to then get into the network, move through the network laterally, find an endpoint. So they looked through the network. I don't know, there's a PowerShell script you can run to view the wireless networks that are in range. So they specifically targeted a computer, a laptop, that was physically in range of company number 2's environment.
Okay.
So then they get into company number 1's computer. They attach to company number 2's Wi-Fi.
Using company 1's computer.
Yeah, from company 1's computer.
Okay.
And I don't know if that one was using stolen credentials or if they came in through, some other network like a passphrase. So now they're in company 2's network where they do something similar. So they're targeting company 3. They find a computer in company 2's network that is in range of company 3's Wi-Fi network. Because in Wi-Fi, if you're doing a Windows pass-through, we don't use multi-factor.
Okay.
So a stolen credential on the web or a brute force credential might not get you into email or any cloud-based services, but it will probably get you onto the network if they're doing it with username and password.
Wow.
So then they sat on company 2's network on this laptop, were able to connect to company 3's corporate Wi-Fi using a username and password. and then pivot through there. And the company that found this activity found it because they were monitoring some servers in this customer environment. They saw some malicious payloads and some other indicators of compromise. The story, so we've got the links in the show note. There's a couple of short write-ups from Wired and some other outlets, but Velocity wrote a full blog about their investigation of this incident. And it's really interesting. I think it's interesting. Living in the Wi-Fi world, this is something that we've talked about for years, but it wasn't rampant. People weren't doing it.
So this is proof that it's actually possible.
Yeah. And this was 2 years ago that it occurred. They've just now released it.
Okay.
The point was, it's the low-hanging fruit. Once you start shutting off, so if you start doing multi-factor, you start locking down those external remote access, VPNs, RDP, they're going to look for the next way in. And everybody always says, oh, well, they're, however many 10,000 miles away, they're across the world. But when you talk about radio technologies and wireless, whether it's Wi-Fi or something else, if you can get something that you can control that has a radio interface on it, you can do a lot of things. I mean, it's clever. I would say it's unsophisticated in that they just use, computers to carry this out. So clever, a little bit sneaky, but it did not require the deployment of any type of special tools. And they did it from inside Russia.
So the attack started in Russia. They found the target in the US and then just went based on what they could see on that Wi-Fi network, from Wi-Fi network to Wi-Fi network to get to their intended target.
Yeah, because think about it. If you look at a Google map, let's say you're targeting Acme. And so the reason that they knew that this was coming from the neighbors, it was a building across the street. And the reason that they figured it out was they finally found through log analysis that when they were doing this, secured wireless 802.1x authentication, the system will pass, the authenticating laptop will pass some parameters, like sometimes it's, MAC addresses, it could be the domain, host name, things like that. So when they realized, oh, this computer that's using whatever, Sally's credentials is always connecting from this conference room that faces out over the street. And now we see that the computer that's connecting is actually on our neighbor's domain. But from an attacker perspective, you can get all of the information you need from Google Maps view.
Right.
So it is pretty scary.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, we'll have that link in the show notes.
Yeah, good stuff there. And I'll, if you guys follow me on LinkedIn, I will be addressing this from a how to mitigate that perspective, because there are several easy things to do. The one other sort of weird thing is that the attackers did come back into that target organization again through the guest Wi-Fi. Now, I don't know all the details of that quite yet. There are definitely ways to pivot between guest wireless and internal networks. So we'll dig a little bit more into that. But I will be posting some stuff on LinkedIn and maybe some free little guides or short webinars or something to help people kind of address that concern.
So we should put your LinkedIn in the show notes too.
Sure. Yeah. Come on over. Free learning.
Free learning. It's always good. So moving on, we've got some vulnerability talk. A pair of vulnerabilities in Palo Alto Networks product called Expedition are being actively exploited. The successful exploit of one vulnerability, quote, allows an unauthenticated attacker to run arbitrary OS commands as root in Expedition, resulting in disclosure of usernames, clear text passwords, device configurations, and device API keys of PAN-OS firewalls. JJ, I wasn't familiar with Expedition. What is the Expedition product?
So I haven't used it, but my understanding of Expedition is it's a tool that every firewall vendor has something similar, which is a conversion tool, a firewall config conversion tool. So, let's say you've got an organization and they've got, I don't want to pick on vendors, but I'm just going to pull stuff out, right? They've got Checkpoint, or they've got, Cisco, or they've got Fortinet, and they're going to be switching to Palo Alto. Or they've got Palo Alto and they're going to switch to a different version of Palo Alto. So again, every vendor has their flavor of this. You load the config files in, it spits out the converted config for you so that you don't have to manually convert the firewall configs.
So instead of starting from scratch from my firewall rules and firewall config, I just use this magical machine to translate it into whatever I'm going from A to B.
Yeah, I'm not going to call it a magical machine. I haven't used Palo's. I will tell you that every other one I've used through all of time, there's still manual intervention to be done with it.
Of course.
It is better than loading stuff into weird, macro scripts in Excel and trying to do it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that the message of this here is a fewfold. Every vendor has a tool like this. These are the types of things I think we don't think about. So, we think about, let's protect the firewall and let's protect remote access and let's do this and let's do that. But I would hazard to say that probably most of us don't think about things like conversion migration tools and the tool itself, which is what was vulnerable in this case, but also where those files are coming from and going to and how we're storing them.
Yeah, this software utility is just maybe sitting out there and you haven't thought about it since you used it, but it's got some really sensitive stuff on it.
Yeah, I mean, passwords, API keys.
Yeah, not to mention device configurations and
Yeah. All the juicy stuff, right? So if you don't want your firewall configs exposed, at least think about it, pay some attention to that. Poor Palo. All of the firewall vendors have had their day in the, I was going to say their day in the sunshine or spotlight. It's more like an interrogation light, right? You walk into the room, the swinging light bulb, under scrutiny. So we've had Cisco, we've had Fortinet recently, and I think now it's Palo's week in that spotlight.
Yes, in the interrogation room. Yeah, because there's also been some other Palo Alto Networks vulnerabilities previously announced that we now know are under active exploit. So if you haven't done the patching, now is the time. But there's also some critical vulnerabilities being exploited that are on the PAN-OS firewalls itself.
Yeah, and there's like, unauthenticated remote code execution and I think you said a privilege escalation with one of them.
If you can use both of these exploits in tandem, you get remote authentication, and then you can use the second one for privilege escalation, which can get you to root if you are successful.
Yeah. So definitely something to pay attention to. I mean, I think, one of the frustrating things about managing network infrastructure is in a lot of organizations, we just kind of do it when we can, or you're in an organization where somebody's security vulnerability management team is shoving a long list of things you need to go patch and you can't really prioritize. But I would say, firewalls, regardless of the vendor, this is one of those things to just pay extra attention to, set yourself up for alerts directly from the vendor for your versions and get those things patched. There is an interesting discrepancy. This is like a little bit of popcorn moment for me, or because usually the researchers and the vendors are working together pretty well. One of the research organizations that's like a nonprofit who, scans the internet and reports on these things is reporting the number of, I don't want to say actively exploited, but vulnerable and targeted in the like range of thousands. And I think Palo is pushing back and saying, no, it's a much, much, much smaller number than that. So I've been just eating my popcorn waiting to see who's actually accurate here because, yeah, that's an interesting little tiff going back and forth.
Yes, you can see the competing interests from both sides on what's the actual number. Okay, links to all those CVs and announcements in the show notes as well if you need to go check on that. We'll move on. JJ, you found another story about the FBI issuing an alert to US-based companies and law enforcement agencies that threat actors are, I guess, stealing government emails and then using those government emails to impersonate a government agency and then reaching out to private companies and saying, we're making an emergency data request. You need to release this data to us, and essentially hoping that they will buy it, that this is actually a legitimate agency requesting this information, and then they'll steal PII.
A little bit shady here because really it doesn't matter what they're doing. So this was, a fake emergency data request. And that is definitely one use case that I would say a feature that the criminals are advertising as a bullet point of like, they're selling these .gov email addresses. They're like, hey guys, here's the 12 ways you can use this information.
Top tips.
And this is just one of them. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what exactly they're doing. Maybe I'm speaking for myself, but typically I think we tend to trust a validated .gov address. Because not anybody can register .gov. So it's a little disconcerting that there's a bunch of .gov email addresses for sale on the dark web, various places, or probably Telegram more likely. And I guess the messages, Drew, when we were doing our prep for the show, one of the things I said is, even coming from a DoD contractor, one of the things that's very common is to whitelist certain domains for mil and gov because of contract requirements. So just, quick sidebar, that doesn't mean they're not getting scanned for, malware, et cetera, but they're not going through the normal like DKIM SPF processing because as a federal contractor, if you hold a major contract, there are typically SLAs that say when one of our purchasing entities contacts your organization, you've got, sometimes it's 4 hours to respond.
Ooh, okay.
So you can't hold and you can't block. .gov and .mil addresses in the US. Now, I don't know about, how other countries handle those things, but I think, whether you work in that part in the DIB or you are just a human, I think when you see a .gov address, you're like, okay, cool. I know that's legit. This story, I think, makes us rethink that.
Yeah, so they're exploiting that, sort of inherent trust that people will give to a .gov address.
All of these scammers, they will scrape full, well, if they have access to the email, they've got the email signatures anyway. But even in the absence of that, when they've registered like copycat domains, they'll get the actual full signature with the logos and everything. Like, they're sneaky.
They are quite sneaky, yeah. And I can also imagine, the language that they're using is about immediacy and this needs to be done right away. And there may be legal consequences if you don't that could, depending on who the recipient is, light some fires.
Yeah, if you get a message like that, whether it's an emergency data request or request for any type of information or interaction, definitely escalate that up to other people and make that a not your problem, make it a somebody else's problem.
At least make some phone calls.
Yeah, at least make some phone calls. Yeah.
Yeah, get somebody on the phone. Moving on. So by this time, when you're hearing this, you've probably heard that there were a recent couple of cable cuts or cable disruptions in the Baltic Sea with cables going between Germany and Finland, and I think Sweden and another country, and various sites, including a couple of joint government press releases, cast aspersions on Russia as a potential cause of these submarine cable disruptions. There's been no official proof. My take is that oftentimes this is like a fishing trawler or, an anchor causing these cuts. It's hard to actually attribute these to specific sabotage, but eyebrows are raised. And JJ, you had some additional thoughts on this.
Yeah. I'm just overly paranoid about different things, and one of them happens to be China. So one of the concerns is that a lot of the undersea cable, and just you guys, I'm fascinated by marine cable. So we have a link in the show notes where you can see the actual cables running through the ocean floors through all of the countries. I don't know. It's fascinating to me. But they are often maintained by Chinese companies and or with, Chinese shipping assets for repairs. And so, one of the thoughts is now we're talking about the same, we're coinciding with the time where we've just had China and other entities attacking and breaching telecom. So now we're saying, okay, well, all of that, remember that, even on cellular, it goes on the wire somewhere. It goes on the cable somewhere.
Yeah.
So how convenient is it if a cable gets cut and you get called, I'm air quoting, to go fix it? What do you have access to and what can you do when you're air quoting fixing that cable? And so that's just part of the concern is we go through these ebbs and flows and these lulls of everybody's kumbaya and getting along in the world. And then we have these warring entities. And then, how far are they willing to go to get the information, the access that they feel like they need?
Yeah. So one of the things in reading about this I learned is that, most ships are supposed to have positioning systems on so that they can be tracked if you are doing illegal things, not just necessarily messing with cables, but illegal fishing or smuggling, you're going to turn that transponder off. So that's why one of the reasons attribution is so hard is because if there's no transponder on, you actually have to see the ship and have a good sense of its location to get a sense of what's happening. It sounds like what you're saying is if I was a nation state and I wanted to intentionally mess with a cable, I might break it and then know that a company that I have some control over is going to be hired to go, quote unquote, fix it. And then I could do nefarious things during that, quote unquote, repair.
Yeah, because in China, again, I feel like I've said this a lot. So those of you that listen to every episode, thank you. And I'm sorry if you've heard this 3 times now. But there isn't the separation of government and business in China that we have here in the United States. You're talking about leaders of the Communist Party embedded within leadership positions in large organizations. And that's not corruption. It's just how their economy works. Uh-huh. So, yeah, I get twitchy anytime I see that type of access. And there's been, again, years of concern and research into, some of China's provisions and providing of those marine cables that are under the sea, but other, connections and cables that they provide to other countries and then just get them on the hook and you're too far down the relationship with them to pull back out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something to think about. It's, sort of like you don't compromise, the security apparatus, you compromise the cleaning crew and get in that way.
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting. Oh, so much to think about. A couple stories before we wrap. First, this is sort of a funny one. Wired is reporting that a former Disney employee who was let go tried to get back at his former employer by allegedly changing all of the menu fonts to unreadable wingding characters.
Wait, unreadable what?
Wingding? It's a font you can choose. Have you not experienced wingding?
I just wanted you to say wingding again. I thought this was hilarious until, well, first of all, he didn't just change the menus. He got into the platform that makes the menus, I think, right? Puts them out. I thought it was funny until I realized what was happening was that there were also food allergies that this person was presumably messing around with. So, like peanuts.
Or at least warnings about food allergies, like this recipe contains peanuts. If you have a peanut allergy, you need to know that. And Disney prints that. But apparently he was, I guess, deleting that or interfering with it in some way so that someone could have a dangerous, life-threatening reaction to a food.
I know peanut allergies are no joke.
Yeah.
So I thought it was funny until I saw that. Then it got kind of a little bit morbid and grave there. Not cool. Not a cool thing to do.
For sure.
Also tried to log into other accounts and basically accidentally launched a denial of service attack by locking other people out of their accounts with an automated script and turned up at one person's home.
Yeah. So this person does seem disgruntled, I guess is the right word. Yeah.
Yeah, that's maybe a few steps past disgruntled. So,
Yeah.
if you're mad at your employer, don't work there. Go do something else. Spread your love in the world. Find a hobby. Just like use your energy for not that type of thing.
I will say I had never thought of restaurant menus as an attack vector, so yet another door opening here for your risk management consideration, as if you didn't have enough.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. Like, let's just dive into that for just a quick second.
Yeah. I mean, the legal ramifications, the potential lawsuits that could hit Disney from that.
Yeah. If somebody died of like any type of allergy like that or had some, serious medical incident related to that and fine, that's just not cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Very not cool.
Turn anything into an attack tool, I guess.
Interesting times. And we'll wrap on one more story, JJ, that you wanted to raise a flag on regarding a vulnerability in Synology, which we're guessing many of our listeners are using.
Yeah, I hear their stuff a lot. I've heard several people tell me they use this product. I'm trying to remember where they're made. I'll look while we're scrolling here. But a lot of the little kind of home and probably small business network attached storage devices have some photo management software on them. And apparently that has become vulnerable and people are attackers are using that to enter and then move laterally in networks and steal data, files, interfere with other applications and do generally not good stuff. So if you are using Synology NAS, go check that out.
Yep. And link in the show notes as always. All right, well, that wraps up this news roundup episode of Packet Protector. If you've got a topic you want us to cover, you can find JJ and I on LinkedIn or at packetpushers.net/community. We've got a free Slack channel that you can join. There are other IT and security pros hanging out there. If you've got a comment, a correction, or a question, you can reach out at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU is for follow-up, and we do appreciate when listeners reach out because we love to engage in conversation and respond. As always, eat your security vegetables.